This is an Apple II, and this is an Apple also. This Apple is the original personal computer, easy to own, easy to use, and both Apples can help you get ahead in school, but this one can help you get ahead in life. It can do forecasts, manage money, edit reports. You can use this Apple thousands of ways to be more productive. Only one problem: you can't eat it.
This is the Belated Tech Musings channel. I'm your host, Belated Tech. Apple products have become so ubiquitous in our lives, it seems that there are as many Apple devices in the world as there are apples. And we have to pay Apple for its products, unlike the free apples from the tree behind me. Apple generates almost $300 billion in annual revenue and is valued at just under $1 trillion. To give you an idea of what the size of those numbers means, the annual U.S. federal budget, the largest in the world, is $4.4 trillion. Apple started, as many tech companies do, as two guys in a garage. The year was 1976, 5 years after the introduction of the Intel 404, one of several commercially available microprocessors that made possible the very idea of a personal computer. The two partners, Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs, had collaborated on several electronics projects during the prior 3 years, with Wozniak as the designer and Jobs as the salesman. The collaboration worked well, so when the two designed and sold a new kit personal computer called the Apple I, its success drew the attention of an investor. That capital infusion made possible the Apple II computer, which became one of the most durable and well-known personal computer products of all time, and the most important predictor of the device-driven 21st century. The Apple II is an 8-bit architecture computer built around an MOS Technology 6502 microprocessor running at 1 MHz and installed with a default 4 kilobyte amount of RAM. The computer was shipped with an audio cassette, not shown here, and a ROM was installed with the integer basic programming language built right in, leaving the precious RAM for other tasking. The original retail price of the computer was $1,298, or $3,700 in 2019 dollars, and $2,638 with a maximum 48 kilobyte of RAM, or $7,500 in 2019 dollars. Eventually, Wozniak designed floppy disk drives for the Apple II for those that wanted to boot their system right from a disk, or wanted the faster access necessary for more advanced software than was possible from a cassette deck. The disk drives required a separately priced expansion card, and up to 2 drives were supported. The MOS Technology 6502 CPU is mounted right next to the expansion slots. The 6502 was a more economical and efficiently designed alternative to the Intel 8080 and the Motorola 6800, an important consideration for Wozniak, who focused obsessively on cost. MOS Technology was purchased shortly after the Apple II launch by competitor Commodore, so Apple used Motorola CPUs for next-generation products. Steve Jobs made sure that the Apple II had a case that looked visually appealing, was ergonomically sensible, and was practical from a maintenance standpoint. Even the keyboard's appearance was considered, with high contrast color chosen for the keys. The Apple II PCB had 24 RAM chips. Memory was increased by replacing the chips with higher values in carefully matched configurations. In the 1970s, it was not uncommon for expensive components like RAM and CPUs to be socketed on the PCB, and the Apple II is no exception to this. The higher cost of socketed chips was justified by ease of maintenance considerations, a trade-off that is still made in 21st century computers.
The video controller displays 24 lines by 40 columns of monochrome uppercase-only output in text mode, low-resolution 40 by 40 pixel 16-color graphics, or high-resolution 280 by 192 pixel 6-color graphics. Output was suitable for display on a composite video monitor or on a regular TV set by way of a separate RF modulator.
The secret to the success of the Apple II was Steve Wozniak's particular genius for efficient system design and his commitment to open architecture. His elegant design for the Apple II meant that its performance was reliable, and open to architecture with 8 expansion slots meant that the adoption of the machine was swift as a plethora of hardware and software designers produced products for it. This accommodating environment created a happy circumstance where business software like VisiCalc, DBase, and WordStar was adapted to Apple II, which in turn made the unit attractive not just to hobbyists, but also to business users. Sales of the Apple II grew every year for 4 straight years, generating enough cash to provide capital for the development of successor products and further adding to the market woes, already reeling from competition from Tandy and Commodore, of first-to-market computer manufacturers IBM and Hewlett-Packard.
We mentioned Hewlett-Packard's earliest scientific desk calculator, which they also referred to as a personal computer, in episode 3. Check out that episode for more about Hewlett-Packard's activities from 1968 to 1975, a time frame just before that of this episode. Wozniak kept an eye on his Apple II design, guiding a team of engineers on improvements that led to the release of the Apple II Plus in 1979. This meant that the two products intended to replace the Apple II, the Apple III and the Lisa, were not designed by Wozniak, but instead by new teams of engineers. Unfortunately, the absence in either program of an intuitive system engineer like Wozniak, the lack of industry technological advancement necessary to make their designs feasible, their relatively closed architectures, and their high price points meant that neither unit was a commercial success. Nevertheless, a number of important technological accomplishments by both teams were later to bear fruit in a new computer design that Wozniak was initially involved in, the Macintosh.
The Macintosh was started as a program to develop a personal computer for consumers. That there was a demand for such a system was more than evidenced by the success of Tandy's TRS-80 line of computers in the late 1970s, and later the success of Commodore's 1980 launch of the VIC-20. However, those systems used text command-based operating systems or crude hotkey-driven menu schemes. Macintosh would instead be designed to operate much like the Lisa, with a graphical user interface but a third of the price.
Commodore's early history of manufacturing personal computers, as well as its ventures in other office equipment, can be seen in Episode 1. Episode 2 covered Tandy's rise and fall in personal computing. Links to both episodes can be found below.
Unfortunately, 2 years into the Macintosh development, Wozniak crashed his personal aircraft, leaving him debilitated for weeks. When he finally recovered, he found that he had lost interest in engineering, so he left Apple to commit time to his own ventures, and Steve Jobs took over the Macintosh team. Although Wozniak returned in 1983, his final departure in 1985 meant the Apple II had lost its key benefactor. Co-founder Steve Jobs' primary contribution to the Apple II was its case design, consistent with his interest in aesthetics and user function, and raising funds to put the Apple II into production and distribute to resellers. Raising funds meant bringing on investors and diluting Jobs and Wozniak's ownership of the company. Investors met a board of directors not always aligned with Jobs and Wozniak's vision for Apple. Jobs was forced to bring in professional managers who had the experience of running business operations that he did not. As a result, a number of critical decisions were made in spite of Jobs, including the premature release of the ill-fated Apple III and his removal from the Lisa development program, which also failed in the marketplace. Jobs' reaction to this shunning by the board was not to retreat to the Apple II development team like Wozniak. To Jobs, the Apple II and the Apple I before it were a means to an end, not an ends to a means. Jobs, of course, knew that the Apple II was the reason why there was an Apple computer, but he despised all the design compromises he had to make with Wozniak to get the engineer to finish the Apple II. Jobs believed his role was to bring about a revolution in computing to the general public, not just to provide nifty hardware for hobbyists. To his thinking, the money that the Apple II raised should have been spent on generation-skipping hardware.
To be fair to the Lisa development team, it took Microsoft 5 years to replicate some of the graphical user interface functionality of the Lisa. Microsoft introduced Windows 1.0 in 1985, but it was already obsolete with the 1984 introduction of the Macintosh OS, which drew many elements from Lisa's OS. It took Microsoft another 5 years to launch a comparable OS to the Macintosh, Windows 3.0, and another 5 years to launch an OS that could actually compete, Windows 95. Meanwhile, the Apple II soldiered on, continuing to generate revenues and profits for the company. The venerable Apple II Plus was replaced by the Apple IIe in 1983, notably still using Steve Jobs' case design, which was then joined in 1984 by the Apple IIc, Apple's first entry into portable computing. The IIc could be used either with a regular monitor or a detachable LCD display.
Although the Macintosh was launched by Steve Jobs with great fanfare in 1984, by 1985 it became obvious that the price of the Macintosh was too low to cover the cost of marketing and manufacturing, and that the specifications of the first model was inadequate to support most of the third-party software developed for it. Thus, the launch model was unprofitable at a time that the company was already reeling from losses caused by the Apple III and the Lisa. This set off a power struggle between Jobs and the CEO of the company at that time, John Sculley, a struggle that Sculley won. So in that same year, Jobs left Apple, and shortly afterwards, Wozniak departed as well. Only 8 years after Apple's founding, both co-founders had exited. Apple was on its own.
The Apple II continued to be sold for 7 more years after the departure of Jobs and Wozniak. The 8-bit based Apple IIe was succeeded by the 16-bit based Apple II GS, although both continued to be sold side by side until the early 1990s. The Apple II line finally came to an end with the departure of CEO John Sculley, who lost his own power struggle, this time with the Apple board of directors. The CEOs that followed refocused the company's dwindling resources on designing more powerful models of the Macintosh.
I hope you enjoyed watching this episode on Apple II, Steve Wozniak, and Steve Jobs. If so, make sure you click on the like button and show your support by clicking on the subscribe button. Clicking on the bell icon will make sure you receive notifications of new episodes. Links to material related to this video, the BTM channel, episodes 1, 2, and 3, and the Apple II can be found below. Be sure to check out the channel feed on Instagram, where I post sneak peeks of upcoming episodes and photos of the products we are working on. Correspondence can be mailed to the post office box address found below. Exclusive content is available to those viewers who subscribe to the channel and Patreon, the link to which is below. Thanks for watching.
Nice.